job creation forward. Party the piracy party. Comrades on the streets, you must stop selling our music on the streets at your lowest prices. You are killing us. Comrades, we cannot continue to suffer. Comrades, we must be educated. Comrades, we must receive education and training. Phambili nge-education, phambili. Ngesikhathi sishisa imoto sishaya amasela buke join emsabalazo. Ngesikhathi sishisa imoto sishaya amasela buke join emsabalazo. Ngesikhathi sishisa imoto sishaya amasela buke join emsabalazo. Job creation forward. Party the piracy party. Comrades on the streets, you must stop selling our music on the streets at your lowest prices. You are killing us. Comrades, we cannot continue to suffer. Comrades, we must be educated. Comrades, we must receive education and training. Phambili nge-education, phambili. Ngesikhathi sishisa imoto sishaya amasela buke join emsabalazo. Ngesikhathi sishisa imoto sishaya amasela buke join emsabalazo. Ngesikhathi sishisa imoto sishaya amasela buke join emsabalazo.
Ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, welcome to
Khwezi Mabasa, WhatsApp audio.
Fresh Perspective. Sorry about that. Ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends of the OR Tambo School of Leadership, welcome to the third episode of Tintswalo's Perspective. We sincerely apologize for starting late. We had some technical issues that we had to deal with, and our guest was just running a bit late as a result of having attended another program. But now we have him. As you know, today we are having a conversation with Dr. Khwezi Mabasa, who will be chatting to us about the need to reimagine the national democratic revolution 30 years after gaining our political freedom. Essentially, this is an important conversation that seeks to track how far we are in advancing the revolution, particularly post 1994. As you would all know, that the program of the ANC is that of the National Democratic Revolution, which seeks to achieve the national democratic society, which is characterized by a non-racist, non-sexist, democratic, united, and prosperous society. And the blueprint of this particular society is the Freedom Charter. So I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to invite Comrade Khwezi Mabasa to join us so that we are able to have a conversation. I know you've been waiting for us for quite some time, and thank you so much for your patience. We really appreciate it and the support that you continue to show to Tintswalo's Perspective. I know a lot of you are sharing posters in different groups. We really, really appreciate that, because that is how the word gets spread around. To say there's this new platform that is bringing new, fresh ideas led by the youth about the future of this country and sharing their experience of the last 8 years of our democracy, as well as sharing a vision of South Africa that they want to see unfold. So, without any waste of time, I'm going to invite Comrade Khwezi Mabasa, or Dr. Khwezi Mabasa, to join me. He will correct me which one he prefers.
No, Comrade Khwezi is okay. Thanks, my leader.
Right.
Comrade Khwezi is okay.
No, thank you very much for joining us, Khwezi. We did apologize to our viewers for starting a bit late due to some technical issues. So, without wasting any time, my brother, I would like you to introduce yourself. Who are you? Where does your activism start? And just tell us a little bit about yourself before we get to the nitty-gritties of our conversation today.
Okay, so my name is Khwezi Mabasa. Professionally, people refer to me as Dr. Khwezi Mabasa, but my name is Khwezi Mabasa. And I am originally from Gauteng, the east of Gauteng, the Tembisa and Kempton Park areas. And I really got into activism in 2 ways. One, being inspired by watching my dad and his activism within the trade union movement, particularly the Food and Allied Workers Union. But then during my high school years, I wasn't really into social justice in terms of participating in organizations per se. I only started to really participate when I got to varsity, where I was a member and leader of SASCO, the Young Communist League, and the ANC Youth League as well. I've also served in COSATU, in the Congress of South African Trade Unions, as the National Social Policy Coordinator. And basically, since then, I've been a researcher, policy analyst,
who's mainly interested in ideas of the left and the liberation movement broadly, and how they relate to the development of our society. Yeah, particularly as it relates to questions of political economy, development, and even citizenship and political agency.
No, thank you very much, Khwezi, for that brief introduction. I guess we're correct when we say Comrade Khwezi. Quite interestingly, I got to meet with you and engage with you for the first time at the book launch of Socialism Nomtomocha by Comrade Mulaudi. And you were part of the panel, and I was quite intrigued by some of the questions that you were raising on that panel, which, have led us to this conversation. But before we get into the conversation, I would like to ask you, a bit of a personal question again, to say, how would you characterize the last 30 years of our democracy, drawing from your own personal experiences, the achievements, the setbacks, just as a foregrounding of this conversation, so that when we begin to talk about the NDR, at least we have a sense and a context in which we are discussing this concept?
So I think that for me, I was born in the mid-80s. So they always say the personal is political. So our personal reflections are related to also the political context in which we're born in. So my consciousness is informed by being born in an era that was seeing probably the most violent period in apartheid, but also in the 1990s, the transition as well to establishing a democratic state. In terms of the last 30 years, I think we have to unpack the different elements that we were looking at and the dimensions. If we look at the area of political and civil liberties, your basic political rights, so the right to vote, freedom of association, the freedom of the media, and all those basic civil liberties, South Africa has done very well. And this is not only confirmed by my personal analysis or analysis of institutions or research that's conducted domestically, but it's also confirmed by international studies on the state of democracy, be it Freedom House and others, the Mo Ibrahim Index, for example. They all laud or celebrate and commend South Africa for their achievements in the areas of political rights and civil liberties, and I think we've done well in that regard. Free and fair elections, the right of civil society to organize. We have also attempted, and I think successfully so, to allow citizens and also organized civil society and different stakeholders to participate in policy processes and legislative processes. We have also a political context where individuals can engage freely and join various forms of associations in civil society, including business, trade unions, and the likes. So I think we've done well in that on that scorecard. And then that coexists with other challenges that we face. The first one is that we're still one of the most unequal societies in the world. And what's particularly concerning in terms of our inequality is that our inequality is intersectional. So in the sense that it has clear race, class, gender dimensions. One would even argue that there's also a clear geographic dimension to our inequality. We still are dealing with the challenges of structural unemployment and poverty in the country. I call it structural because it's related to generational causes and factors that go beyond just the individual. So I think that's also another challenge that we've had. We still deal with challenges also related to racism and sexism in society. So even though we have the constitution, we have the framework, we have the courts, and we have the legislation that attempts to address both, but I think we still deal with the challenge of racism and sexism as well in society. And when you look at the underlying causes of these challenges, especially the socio-economic ones, the core issue is that we haven't really fundamentally altered the structure of our economy, and it's reproducing these different negative socio-economic outcomes. But this does not necessarily mean that in the area of socio-economic development, there haven't been gains in the past 30 years. So today, the 30 years review was being released or published, and being handed over to the president and to the public. And I'm sure in that review, the achievements in key areas such as access to social security will be highlighted. The fact that there's been a substantial increase in terms of access to basic services, so water, energy, or electricity, housing and the likes. The improvements in access to education, and the increases in the level of literacy. So in terms of access, there's been some gains in the socio-economic development area. But obviously, there are debates about the quality of that access to all the socio-economic and public goods that I've highlighted, and the inequality that exists when we look at how citizens access those basic services and goods. I think South Africa has also played an important role internationally, both within the region, the African region, the peacekeeping role, the institutionalization of the AU and NEPED and the AU-related structures. South Africa played a huge role in that, and the way that South Africa continues to reassert, I think, the region's agenda in various multilateral platforms is also important. And then the most recent cases, of course, the Palestinian advocacy. And I think those are some of the gains that we've had over the past 30 years.
No, thank you very much for that brief analysis. I find it to be quite helpful, because one could even make the point that, in fact, it's out of some of those inefficiencies that you point to, or the current challenges, that we need to reimagine the national democratic revolution itself, so that we can ramp up the pace at which we need to transform society and get to the envisaged society that is the national democratic society. But before we speak about that, could you kindly unpack for us, what does this notion of the national democratic revolution mean? Where does it stem from, and why is it still a relevant thing to pursue today?
Yes, so the conception of the national democratic revolution can be mainly traced back to debates within what we'll call the broad tradition of socialism globally, and at the heart of this particular conception and the debates around it was, how do you transition from a capitalist society, right, to a socialist society? Okay. And there were different debates that were informed by the context of different countries, right, that were part of these debates internationally on the socialist tradition, particularly the debates in the Third Communist International. And the South African case was one of the important, for lack of a better word, I'd say case study in this debate, for a number of reasons, right? The first one was that South Africa and its historical development, South Africa's historical development was largely influenced by colonialism, right? And the fact that colonialism played a huge role in the construction of the South African society, okay? And that colonialism obviously coincides with the expansion of global capitalism. And this is an important point to make, because when people think about capitalism, they normally trace it to its developments and its basic tenets and characteristics within the European context, but don't factor in its relation to colonialism, especially when you look at former colonies, particularly those in the global south. And then the South African case was also central to this debate because it also involved questions around racism, right, and racial inequality as well. So, in other words, when there was a debate about how do you transition from a capitalist to a socialist society, the debates had to consider all these contextual factors. The third one, before I move on to the next point that I forgot to mention, is also looking at the structure of these particular economies, especially those that are colonies, right, or have had a history of colonization, and looking at how this also affects the transition to socialism. And in the end, the Communist International basically adopted a resolution, and obviously there were communists from the South African context who participated in those debates, that emphasized that in the South African context, you first need a broad multi-class national struggle in order to deal with the national question as it pertains to colonialism, but also the questions around racism. And then afterwards, that would establish the conditions for moving towards a socialist society. And those were was a basic framing. And this informed how the liberation movement then approached struggle in terms of political alliances, analyzing the context of South Africa and the different organizations that are involved in trying to dismantle apartheid and what strategies they should employ. And so that is basically the context of the debate. Obviously, society has been transformed, and one has to ask questions about the applicability of that particular of the basic understanding of the NDR to our current political and social economic context. The debates in the NDR around the NDR in the socialist tradition are obviously more complex than what I've presented. But I think what I've done is just presented the basic principles that inform the NDR and how they relate to certain context.
Now, you quite eloquently articulated, I think, in the simplest terms of what informs this particular concept of the National Democratic Revolution. And I guess this is also attached to the characterizations that were made that we were a colonization of a special type where, the secular colonizers, they were secular colonizers who settled for successive generations and formed part of, the society that we define as South Africa, right? Now, what I would want to understand is that normally when we speak about the NDR, we speak about two phases, right? And I think you spoke a bit about that. First, we need political freedom because the majority of our people were excluded from political participation by segregated laws, and how even colonization played out in South Africa, where there was that racial complexity attached to it, where a majority of Africans, were disenfranchised in very inhumane ways. And when we speak about the NDR, there's that first part of political freedom, of which I think 1994 becomes the starting point of that political freedom. Some scholars, in fact, refer to the 27th of April as Independence Day, for South Africa, where we were completely free from the shackles of colonization and, of course, subsequently apartheid. And then, of course, then there's the second phase, which speaks about the socio-economic transformation. Now, when we take that into consideration in those two phases, and maybe you can speak a bit about that concept of two faces. And you look at where we are now, taking into consideration your contextualization or conception of the last reflection of the last 30 years. Where are we in terms of the NDR, and how do we get to a far much better place than where we are right now, if ever we're not at a better place?
Yeah, so when we look at the basic tenets, sorry, excuse me, I've got a bit of flu, but when we look at the basic tenets of the NDR as it pertains to different phases and also as it relates to some elements of the national question, yes, the one is the idea of political freedoms and civil liberties, right, and establishing a democratic nation. But it's not only about just the form or the institutional form of that democratic nation. It's also about linking that to how that it relates to questions around racism, questions around tribalism, and one would even argue around even gender. So, in other words, when you talk about building a united society at that level, you're also relating it to these four other forms of structural exclusion that exist. Um, and it's important to have that intersectional lens so that we don't just reduce it to just, oh, it was about just establishing political freedom. You establish political freedom to address debates around the national question and around what constitutes a nation. And one of the key and some of the key questions that surround the idea of what constitutes a nation is breaking down or addressing racism, gender, tribal identity markers, and stratification and social differentiation. And so that's the one thing that I wanted to mention, and that if you look at the political and the civil liberties dimension and the racial ones, and even the tribal and gender, in terms of the laws, the legislation, there's been huge strides, but we're still battling with racism. In some cases, we're still battling with gender inequality, and we're still battling with the idea of a common idea of what constitutes South African identity. And then, when it comes to the idea of stages, I think there's been a lot of literature and debates within the socialist tradition, especially in the Marxist tradition, around whether this idea of stages is useful, and whether we shouldn't rethink this idea of there's a first and there's a second phase. And maybe we should be pursuing the transformation of society concurrently. The second issue that has arisen around the debate around stages is the conception of stages also relevant to the changing class structure of South Africa? So in this sense, we now have the black middle class, which has largely increased. Okay, we know that even sections of the working class have had access to certain material gains, and we have what we call an aspirant black capitalist class. Some would argue that we even have a small or community capitalist class. But also, we also exist in a democratic context, right? So, and that democratic context has questioned the traditional relationship, which was between authoritarianism and capitalism, which was at the center of how to conceptualize the national democratic revolution and debates about the colonialism of a special type. So there are all these structural changes that also sort of nudge us or compel us to rethink this particular framing around the stages, but around how we even characterize our society as well. So this means that the NDR is still applicable, but how it's interpreted and understood has to be related to the material realities of a post-apartheid democratic South Africa. Yeah.
No, thanks for that. In fact, this is one of the things you raised at the book launch, which really caught my attention. And I would ask you now that if you were to reimagine how we should conceptualize and pursue this revolution in the current context, what would be the couple of things, maybe three or four things that you propose that we should consider, and I think this is particularly important, because even when you look at, for example, the issue that you speak about of the transformation of stratas in society, where when we now want to describe the motive forces of the revolution, do we still want to stick to just looking at people who we define as the working class, blacks and Africans in particular, especially when you consider the fact that just to look at the number of people working in South Africa, there seems to be an emerging lumpen proletariat, with a lot of people being discouraged from seeking work and, ending up being unproductive. But these people are still, majority of them, blacks and Africans. So when you speak about the motive forces, and you stick to the original conceptions of blacks and Africans in particular, and largely focusing on the working class, are we not excluding a large section of society in that particular conceptions? So if you were to say to us, I think these are the 2-3 things that we should consider as we reimagine this thing, what would be those propositions?
Okay, the first one is to remember that the interpretation and the conceptualization of the NER within the liberation movement is also quite contested, okay? And it's contested because for some, the NER is basically a theory of transition that leads us to a socialist society, okay? And for others, it's just the establishment of a national democratic society that isn't necessarily socialist. And I think this is an important point, right? Because I want to suggest that I hold the view that the ANC as a liberation movement isn't necessarily a socialist organization. I see the ANC as a social democratic organization that has social democratic roots. Even if you look at the African claims, and other documents of the ANC, it's clear. I would even argue that the Freedom Charter itself is not, it's more of a social democratic, not necessarily socialist document. So the one thing is, I think we have to acknowledge that there are those, I'm not going to say contending, but there are those two the views of where the NDR leads us, right? And we have to deal with that. And it's important to also deal with that because if we are leading towards the establishment of a social democratic society or of a socialist society, we have to understand what does social democracy look like in the contemporary era, and what does a socialism in the 21st century look like as well, especially building on the lessons that we've learned from the 20th century. The second important thing that I would definitely focus on is on restructuring the political economy of South Africa. I alluded to the point earlier on that I think that our political economy is largely still racialized by the basic tenets of racialized capitalism, okay? The exploitation mainly of black cheap labor, segregated development, the concentration in the different sectors in terms of ownership patterns, the continued deindustrialization, and even if you look at the employment equity reports, there's been some improvement made, but to a large extent, when you look at the structure of the employee hierarchy within the labor movement, it's still not far from the old apartheid racially segregated workplace. So these are just different elements of what I think we need to restructure within the political economy. And we need to address these issues if we want to make strides in terms of employment, poverty, inequality, and the likes. I also think that it's equally important to look at the concepts that we use. So concepts like triple oppression, gender, race, and class, concepts like NDS, motive forces, and ask ourselves whether those concepts and theoretical frameworks are still applicable to the society that has developed over the past 30 years. And how do they inform new forms of struggle that are emerging, and how are they related to even questions around the ANC's relationship with the youth and organizational renewal as it relates to youth political activism. So those are some of the key issues that I would highlight.
You know, very interesting, very interesting. With us here, we have Dr. Khwezi Mabasa. For those who don't know him, you're welcome to your questions on any of the live platforms you're on. We're able to see your comments this side. We can even display them on screen. If you have any questions, please, you're welcome to post them. Now, looking at this issue of the political economy and this concept that you speak of, which is still prevalent and persistent, of, you know, manifestations of racial capitalism in society, there's been arguments that have been made to say that part of the reasons why we are not moving at a faster pace in terms of advancing the national democratic revolution as the liberation movement led by the African National Congress is that, one, there seems to be an adoption of neoliberal conceptions of development that are being pursued by the African National Congress. But secondly, even decolonial scholars would say we have not really done much to decolonize the state itself and what the state is supposed to do in terms of advancing development in a post-colonial state. So would you agree with those two arguments, and would you say they have, you know, impeded our pace of advancing this revolution at a satisfying rate?
Well, let's start with the one of the state. I think the truth of in this debate, or the truth of the matter in this debate around the nature of the state, must first be grounded in first our constitution, right? And how our constitution sets the framework for the particular state structures that we have. Now, if one looks at our constitution and our systems of governance, they are very clear in terms of establishing a state that is, one, sovereign, but also, two, allows for popular or public participation in the making of laws, but three, also allows for processes of electing leaders who occupy positions within the state using democratic means. And then there are also a lot of pieces of legislation that also govern how we even appoint state officials and the likes. So at that practical level, I would not characterize the state as being inherently or colonial, or the post-apartheid state as being inherently colonial. The other element around the debates around the state is whether we've established a state that acts in the interest of just a particular class in society, or just a capitalist class in society. And therefore the state is viewed as just an instrument of the reproduction of that particular capitalist system. My sense over the past 30 years is that if you look at the nature of the South African state and how it's intervened in the economy, is that largely it has intervened on the basis of, I think, two schools of thought in the political economy. The one, I think, is the more social democratic or Keynesian political economy thought. So there's been a lot of emphasis on questions around redistribution. But at the same time, these social policy measures have also coexisted with, I think, a mostly neoliberal policy framework. Uh, and so I think the two coexist. And I think our inability to restructure our political economy speak to this form of state intervention that has mostly been based on the key tenets of neoliberalism for a long time. So the emphasis on market-led development, the emphasis on financial liberalization, uh, the emphasis on supporting privatization in some cases, and all the other tenets of what constitutes the neoliberal political economy. So for me, I think that's where the challenge lies, and I think there's recognition that we need to move beyond that particular paradigm, uh, and that is at the center of our questions around economic restructuring. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Before I add the question that is here, there's a question here from Mantombi Nkosi, who says, what then becomes the role of the South African Communist Party in advancing all of this? I suspect she's referring to the proposed shifts of thought that you have put forward, and of course this new economic trajectory that you are proposing as well, to say we need to move away from this neoliberal policy framework if we are to make any meaningful impact moving forward. And maybe as you answer that, another question I would like to posit is there has been theories of building a developmental state, and Comrade John Chitens actually wrote a paper most recently speaking about assessing whether or not we are making any advances, meaningful advances in becoming a developmental state, and making the point that at the center of a developmental state, if we were to learn from the Southeast Asian countries, it is this central coordinated planning that is able to bring all key stakeholders of the state to act together towards a particular long-term vision. And seemingly in South Africa, particularly post-2008, we didn't see that sort of, a centralized planning. But the period between, particularly, 1994 to 2008, there were attempts. I mean, he speaks about the planning. Forgot what is the PCAS. Forgot what it stands for in full, but it was a planning unit that sat in the presidency. If you look at the RDP as well, where after the adoption of the RDP, there was an office of the RDP that was temporarily placed in the presidency in order to source resources and to coordinate that policy position into implementation plans and long-term visions. So when you look at that sort of analysis of a developmental state, would it be able to coincide with the current framework of neoliberal policies? But also, if not, what needs to be done, in order for us to become a fully fledged developmental state? And is actually being a developmental state the right way to go?
So the idea of the developmental state, interestingly, has featured in a lot of the ANC's discussion documents on the idea of transforming the political economy. I think the first time it was explicitly mentioned was probably the mid-2000s, but even if you read even Ready to Govern and other documents you can see that there are aspects or features of a developmental state there. Um, and often the debate of the developmental state has taken a very narrow form where the focus is just on bureaucratic efficiency and the ability of the state to deliver in terms of its basic mandate, in terms of services, administration, and the likes, and the provision of public goods, which is an important aspect or dimension of the developmental state, of course, underpinned by a meritocratic bureaucratic order or system, right? But when you look at the origins of this theory of the developmental states, it's mainly located to the transformation that happened in the East Asian developmental states. And what's interesting there is that the focus and the historicization of that transformation wasn't just based on just building efficient and meritocratic bureaucracies. It was actually largely based on transforming the structure of those economies. So moving those countries from countries that were largely producing primary goods, that were largely not that highly industrialized, that were largely achieving low human development sort of indicators, to countries where the structure of the economy, both domestically and how it intersects with the global economy, is transformed. And this is an important point because it means that the idea of the developmental state hinges, or it is based on restructuring the industrial base of your particular economy. So the examples are countries like Japan, South Korea, and the likes. Okay, that we know were able to develop certain key industrial sectors, change the nature of the trade that they had with other countries in the global across the world, but particularly in the global north, and at the same time achieve huge developmental indicators. So what I'm trying to point out is that in the South African context, that really has not happened. In fact, what we've had deindustrialization. We're still largely dependent on mining. I know that the direct contribution of mining to GDP has decreased, but if you look at our exports, mining still plays a significant role. But also in the South African context, we've also had the growth of financialization and business services in the economy, which has also hampered the development of specific industrial sectors as well, and shifted the economy towards the interest of financial and capital markets rather than developing other productive sectors. The other issue about the characterization of a developmental state is the fact that the state plays a role in determining which sectors should be prioritized and how they should be supported, especially in a context where the private sector does not want to invest because the risk is too high, where the state plays a role in that. The scholars like Hajun Cheng and writers of the developmental state refer to this idea of an entrepreneurial state. And the other attribute that's also important is the centrality of state ownership in protecting the public interest in the development of the economy. So in my view, I think we have the aspiration to be a developmental state. But if you look at these structural characteristics or tenets of what constitutes a developmental state, we don't meet the criteria. And of course, the last that I forgot to mention, but also was important, is that the developmental states were also judged by a particular developmental outcome that they produced. And we haven't met that.
No, thank you very much, Comrade Khwezi. You can proceed to answer this question by Comrade Mantombi. I'm sorry about the flu. I hope even our viewers are safe. This bug of flu, it's spreading thick and fast.
Sorry, can you just see me? I lost you for a while there. Can you see me?
No, I was saying thank you very much for that response on that conception of a developmental state. I have a further question to poke, but
yeah, I just wanted to check whether you can see me. I lost you for a while there.
No, I can see you. I can see you. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the question of the SACP, I think the SACP still needs to play an important role in our society, particularly at when we look at questions around um, the fact that we still live largely in a racialized capitalist society, and therefore we need alternatives in terms of our socio-economic development path. Um, And I think what the SACP has to assist us with in society is developing those alternatives on the back of also reflecting on the successes and shortcomings of socialist experiments in the 20th century. But also, too, I think the SACP is still important in the context of connecting these concepts around the NDR, these concepts around social transformation, with the lived experiences of working class communities in our society. I am particularly concerned about the extent to which the SACP has connected with some significant policy struggles in our community. Struggles around food security, struggles around issues connected to public transport, and other major areas of public goods that primarily have a significant impact on the livelihoods of the working class. I also think that the other role of the SACP is to also, I think, address these difficult questions around the intersecting relationship between race and class in South Africa. I mean, the SACP has always done this historically in the 20th century, but I do think that there are slight changes in that relationship between race and class in the makeup of South African society. And we need the SACP to theorize about those particular changes. So those are some, I think, some of the key roles of the SACP.
I'm sorry. Sorry, I just had a technical issue there. I think we have lost Dr. Khwezi. He will join us again now. I can see there's another question here, which I'll pose to him in a moment. I'd missed a large part of what he had said in responding to that question. But I think the essence of what he was saying is that the SACP needs to continue playing that thought leadership role that it used to play in terms of theorizing the socio-economic conditions we find ourselves and even thinking about the future, including even this proposition that has been made that we need to rethink some of the concepts that we use, like the NDR itself, the NDS, as well as, this issue of the motive forces. And I think the last thing I heard was that the SACP needs to also assist us in understanding how this racial class complex plays out in the South African context, which I think it's very important. In fact, I think it was Comrade former President Thabo Mbeki at the Walter Sisulu lecture who posed the question to say, seemingly the SACP has relegated itself to playing an armchair critique position. It needs to start accounting as to how far it is in terms of building a socialist order, and that really speaks to the impact that the SACP needs to have in society, because it does not exist only as a critique of the African National Congress, but it has a particular historical mandate that it needs to achieve. Khwezi, welcome back. And thank you so much for responses. I'm sorry, I'd lost you a bit there. I had a technical issue, but I'm back. So you can continue off.
Yeah.
But as you continue, there's another question here by Nhlonipheni Jeffrey Makanya, who says, looking at the years of South African bourgeoisie democracy with a society that is inspired by capitalism, how can the NDR even go into the second phase? Secondly, which party have been leading the struggle for the NDR? I suspect is saying which party has been leading the National Democratic Revolution.
So the last point that I wanted to mention around the role of the SACP is also looking at the importance of conceptualizing what I would say what contemporary socialism looks like. And this is important because we know, as I said earlier on, we know of both the successes and the failures of the 20th century attempts at establishing socialist states and societies. So I think one of the other key roles of the SACP is looking at what does contemporary socialism look like. And I think this even includes engaging some contemporary or modern or whatever it is forms of how to organize the economy that are being implemented in parts of the world. So it's particularly in South America and other places, right? Which question the idea of individual ownership and promote social ownership, which are based on a different logic that moves us away from capitalism. And there's all these debates that are happening right now, and around the social economy, solidarity economy, eco-socialism. And so I think it's important. That's the last point that I wanted to make before I got cut. So I didn't get to this other question about. Sorry, I'm just trying to read it.
Yeah.
So this whole debate around the phases, I think I addressed it earlier on, and I said that one of the things that we have to accept is that there are these two conceptions around the logical conclusion of the NDR, right? And these logical conclusions either lead us to a socialist society or a national democratic society that isn't necessarily a socialist one. So that's the first thing. And then the second point that I also wanted to make was this question around developing a theory of transition around stages has been challenged, right? Some people have argued that you've got to develop processes of social transformation concurrently and you can't separate them. And I think the easiest way that I can think about it in a very practical and easy way and in a very practical way in the contemporary era is the critique around how neoliberalism has undermined democracy and how to reclaim democracy from neoliberalism, both politically but also socio-economically, right? And in that case, then you can pursue social transformation on concurrently and in multiple social institutions. So I think there's a lot of interesting debates around whether that two-stage approach still applies, and if it doesn't, how do you take forward 3 years of transition in the contemporary era? I think that was the first part of the question. The second one was, please remind me, sorry, I can't see it.
So the second one was that who has been leading the National Democratic Revolution?
I mean, of course, it's been the African National Congress has been leading the National Democratic Revolution, and we've also outlined some of the key socio-economic and political gains that we've experienced as a society under that particular leadership so far.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Khwezi, and I'm sorry for the interruption. There's a comment here, I'm sure you can see it, but it says the party has been missing in action in defense of the working class, silent on below poverty line wage increase, the huge unemployment rate, job reservation for below 35, and unity in COSATU, no progress on consolidating working class power. So I guess that's just a comment, an opinion, really. And I guess you have said, you've given us a mouthful in terms of what you think the role of the party should be, particularly at a thought leadership level, but I think also at an advocacy level, even in terms of its activism. You know, I even mentioned when you were absent here to say, Mbeki once made, former President Thabo Mbeki once made a scathing comment at the Walter Sisulu lecture to say, seemingly the SACP has taken a position to be an armchair critique of the ANC, but they are yet to account to society as to how far they are in terms of achieving their socialist objectives. And I guess you've just given us some of the practical things that can be done to achieve that. Now, we are going into elections now, and there are different manifestos flying around, including that of the African National Congress. And in terms of what we've just spoken about and the kind of reimaginations that have to be considered, do you feel that the current manifesto is some sort of a stepping ladder towards that particular direction in terms of what it identifies as the critical issues that need to be addressed at the moment, but also sort of casting a long-term view in terms of what needs to change? You know, I mean, there are issues around the issues of the need to transform the financial services sector. There are issues around the need to reindustrialize, you know, job creation. So do you think that those issues and the way they are articulated, we are beginning to see the kind of shift that is necessary to rearrange the political economy of South Africa in the manner that you have just described to us?
Well, I think there are elements of it. I think the first one is I think the importance of developing a comprehensive social security program in the country, particularly the debate around the universal basic income card, but the basic income card, I think is central because of the economy, the both the household but also the economy-wide impact that can have. The only thing I think is just that it's important to link social policy to also in our efforts aimed at reindustrializing our economy. So in other words, to pose questions about how do we link our social policy spend to restructuring these sectors, the food system, the retail system, for example. So I think that's the first thing. I think the emphasis on basically industrialization is important, and it's important for a number of reasons. Huge potential in terms of job creation, but also too, it has the potential, if done successfully, to also make sure that we change or transform the nature of our trade and investment patterns in the country, so that we also start to produce manufactured goods and secondary goods, right? And I think that's important for our positioning in the international political economy. The third reason why I think also industrialization is important, it also helps us to identify key sectors that should drive in South Africa's structural economic transformation in the next years. And then there are also other positive effects like skills development and the likes. So I think it's good that there's a focus on that. I also think it's good that the manifesto also in a way still recognizes the centrality of the state in economic development, and that we're not going to achieve our economic goals with supporting ideas of minimal state development, either in terms of ownership or incentives in the economy and other regulatory measures. I also think that the manifesto also raises important issues around transforming the nature of racialized capitalism, right? And rethinking our models of Black economic transformation and how to improve the attainment of our employment equity targets. Because this question around inequality, especially racialized inequality, hampers economic development in several ways. So we need to address that. I think, though, it's still not clear about whether we have to think about transforming our macroeconomic framework in order to achieve all these other goals that I've just highlighted, especially when it comes to our fiscal policy choices. So that's still something that I think is still unclear and needs further refinement and debate. I also think that it's also important for us to go deeper around the question of the local state and development. It's clear that we want to address our structural economic impediments. We have to focus on moving beyond this idea of the local state as just a provider of just public goods and services or the service delivery paradigm, but also think about how the role of the local state in diversifying local economies. In other words, I would explain this as the local developmental state. Yeah. And I also think that the emphasis on the international political economy and also multilateralism is another important aspect of the manifesto, because you can't talk about South Africa's development without addressing some of the global economic imbalances that exist in terms of trade, investment, but also looking at questions around regional integration and how to fast track that as well. Yeah.
No, very key, very key. I actually like those inputs, particularly where you ended off on this question of regional integration, because seemingly it seems like we are disintegrating at a very fast rate. I mean, you look at the developments that are happening in silos in the region, and largely on the continent. And you begin to ask yourselves to say, but how are we then going to take advantage, of key interventions such as the Africa Free Trade Area Protocol if we seemingly we have not started even having a serious discussion in terms of integrated development. I think in as far as Africa is concerned, ECOWAS is really doing great, and there's a lot to learn from how they are coordinating their development as a region. So I think that's a very key point. But there's a comment here, and I think it has questions loaded in it from Comrade Sive. It says the unresolved national question in South Africa, in South African left thought under apartheid and beyond. So how is the NDR policy? How will the NDR policy assist in terms of making sure that Black people, in particular in South Africa, get their land and dignity back? Because without that being implemented, we'll never have peace in this country. And maybe before you answer this, let me pose another question, because we're left with 8 minutes. So we're going to stop at past just to make up the time that we lost. We've obviously focused a lot on the political economy and its structural challenges, and how they continue to still persist. But even if we were to look at the imperative of building a nation, and you look at the emergence of new parties and how they continue to fragment what we know as the motive forces, the Blacks and Africans in particular, and coupled with that, there is ethnic mobilization rearing its ugly head in these contestations of elections, and polarization around ethnicity also creeping up. How should we best respond to that? And I guess part of the answer says, for as long as you do not deal with the economic structure and its challenges, you might as well fail to resolve some of these challenges. But if we were to consider some of the practical things that can be done to actually minimize that fragmentation, particularly of the motive forces of the revolution, what are some of the things that we need to consider?
Yes, let's start off with the issue around. I mean, I wasn't clear about this question that was written in the chat, but I think the comrade is basically speaking about the land question, right? And
Yeah.
that land is central. So the first point I think to make is that I think the land question, especially in the South African context, has both material and non-material aspects. Okay, and what I mean by that is that when I speak about material aspects, is that land is tied to economic transformation and production and livelihoods, right? Um, and not only in the context of just agrarian or agricultural value chains, but other aspects of livelihoods as well. So I think that's the material element, but there's also a non-material element, which is that land is also an important part of identity formation, dignity, the sense of belonging and culture in our society. So there are meanings of land that go beyond just the material. So for me, I think, and why I'm mentioning this is that I think that the focus has been a lot on a narrow conception of land, which is basically land in just in its material sense and how it relates to the agricultural value chain and the agrarian question broadly. And I think that's been one of the fault lines in how we've approached the land policy. But the second reality also when it comes to the land question is the debate around the multiple uses of land, right? Because my sense is that South Africans' advocacy for land reform policies are not centered on just developing land for just food production or within the context of the agricultural sector or value chains. There's a question around land and housing. There's a question around land and preserving public spaces. There are questions around land and the attempts of sections of the community to use that land for various entrepreneurial activities. So the land question, I think, is multi-layered and isn't just a question around, the idea of just the agrarian political economy. The third thing I want to say about land is that we can't also separate the land question from the general logic of a capitalist and neoliberal social economic system, because the approaches of the land or to land have largely been influenced by factors related to markets and how markets approach questions of land ownership and property value and the likes. The other aspect of land that I think is important is the connection between land and segregated development. And so what I'm trying to sort of outline here is that we have to address all these different aspects of land in relation to the structure of our societies, but also the structure of our economy, and delve deeper into the relationship between land and the reproduction of human livelihood and lives, but also look at the non-material aspects of land and how those also influence questions around land justice. And these include the cultural belonging and other dimensions as well. And then you also pose a question around ethnicity that I've also been thinking about for a long time. And I've been trying to think, what is the basis of this of continued ethnicity in a context where you have a democratic South Africa and you have laws that position our society as a united society, common culture, common values. And for me, I think there are a number of factors. The one is I think ethnicity and even tribalism was developed over decades, and how it was developed over decades was through a number of, measures. One, the perversion of African history and culture, and that perversion then fed into the institutionalization of ethnic identities, norms, and values in society, and even at times even conflict. Uh, and we need to go to the root of undoing that perversion. And that's where I find the work of people like Mahmoud Mamdani or Mamdani interesting, right? Around this question around citizens and subjects, but also this debate around native as political identity. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is how ethnicity is also linked to how we've restructured development in the country and specifically segregated development. And that when we speak about building integrated communities, we need to basically undo that. At not only an identical level, like what I explained in the first point, but also at how people reproduce their lives and their livelihoods. And dealing with the economic structural segregation that informs ethnicity. And then the third element is also looking at the critiques that have been developed around traditional leadership and traditional leadership governance in the country, and how sometimes that also reproduces ethnic identities and ethnic chauvinism or ethnic animosities in our communities. So those are the different, I think, aspects that we have to look at when we want to address this question of ethnicity.
Thank you very much, my brother. Last question. Last question. Yeah, just making up time for our audience, for thanking them for our patience. I know that you're not feeling well, and I'm sorry for putting you through this. But the last question is from Anthony Penny Jeffrey Makine again. Says, what's your take on the SACP calling for the reconfiguration of the alliance? Does this alliance need reconfiguration? And maybe just to add to that, two more questions. Is the African National Congress still relevant to lead the National Democratic Revolution? Or will that be determined by this reimagination that you are imploring us to do? And lastly, how do we deal with the ideological differences, which for me sometimes seems to be frivolous and technical or tactical rather than strategic, and real, between the emerging parties within what we call the motive forces. I mean, if you were to just do a simple survey of what these Black and African parties represent, you'd find that you can narrow that into a couple of ideas which converge, right? So how do we, in this context of attempting to also build a united nation and establish a South African identity, of which you said it's still very difficult to actually pinpoint what becomes a South African identity? How do we ensure that convergence in terms of ideas, and in an attempt to build that national unity?
Yeah, so I'm very hesitant to answer this question around the alliance. I think, this debate about the SACP and the alliance is a long-standing debate. And for me, I think if one is to really interrogate what is the basis of this debate, you have to pose some serious ideological and I would even argue political questions around the alliance. So the first one would be, we know what historical context informed the alliance. right? Particularly as this relates to the NDR and the connection between the nationalist and the socialist struggle, okay, in the South African context, and how that then informed partly uh, this question around why we need to form an alliance with different movements that are challenging colonialism and apartheid. Um, so the question or the point that I'm trying to raise there is, how has the transition to democracy affected that particular connection between the national and the socialist struggle, and is the socialist struggle, sorry, and is the alliance the correct vehicle to pursue that? The second thing around this debate around the reconfiguration of the alliance, I think it also has to do with also looking at tangibly what have been the socio-economic gains in terms of policy and political positioning uh, that the SAP has had in the alliance, um, and can those gains be taken further within the context of the alliance, um, or do we need a different form of political organization or strategy to take those gains further? I think the third thing that's also important in the South African context is this, again, this relationship between race and class in the South African context, and whether one pursue a purely socialist struggle based on class in the South African context without still taking up some of these key issues around race and how that relates to the unresolved national question. So I'm just giving some examples there of some serious ideological consideration and political considerations that I think need to be part of the alliance debate. I'm not convinced by this argument of just looking at electoral support and things like that. So I think those are some of the key issues that we have to respond to when we debate this question around the alliance. Why was it formed? What are the ideological underpinnings? What have been the socio-economic and political gains? What is the new program for a socialist future in South Africa? Does that align within the context of the alliance? If not, do we need a different political strategy? Those are some of the things that I think we have to address and move beyond this narrow, I think, focus on just the elections sometimes, which can be problematic. Yeah, the whole debate around, is the ANC still relevant to read the National Democratic Revolution? I think that question is answered by what I said earlier on in the discussion about how one defines the end objectives of the National Democratic Revolution, and how you define that. Then one, it informs whether you think the ANC is still relevant, right? So for me, that's why I think this question of resolving the end goals and what that looks like is important for determining that. But at this current conjuncture, I'd say that the ANC is still relevant. If you look at some of the key socio-economic and political challenges that we're still trying to address in our society. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. I don't know if you can quickly just answer my last question to say, how do we resolve the ideological differences between parties that are emerging and seemingly are fragmenting the motive forces? But when you look at the ideas that they are bringing to the table, some of them are quite frivolous. You know, the differences are frivolous or tactical, but strategically, we seemingly agree at one convergence. So the ANC, as this leader of this revolution and by extension, a leader of society, as you've just reaffirmed, what are some of the things we should consider in trying to mend those differences and strike a convergence? Because this, I think, has a serious implication on whether or not we are able to achieve building a united nation that will be able to give us the South African identity that you spoke about earlier, that we're still struggling to pinpoint what is actually a South African identity. So how should the African National Congress really engage other political parties, particularly those that are emerging in sections of the motive forces, in order to strike some sort of a ideological convergence and an appreciation of a particular end goal?
So my first point is that the idea of a common South African identity is supposed to take us to a non-racist identity, a non-ethnic identity, and preferably even a non-sexist identity. So that common identity is supposed to take us to a society where, where there's a common idea of humanism that makes us untangle essentially colonial and apartheid racial categorization and identity formation in society. So that's the first point that I want to make in response to your question. The second thing is that I think we must also accept, I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question.
I think we lost Comrade Khwezi. But yeah, thank you so much, guys, for joining us for today's conversation. We've went a little bit overboard on time because we wanted to make up for the time that was lost in the beginning of the session. We truly, truly, truly apologize for the delay that we had. We are working on getting the space to become a far more efficient space. There will be challenges there and there, but we will be able to overcome each and every challenge that we come across. Please keep supporting this particular space. This is really a fresh platform for fresh ideas where young people could have uncensored conversations about how they relate one to the movement as led by the African National Congress, about their experiences in the last 30 years of our democracy, and the kind of vision that they have for South Africa. And I think from today's conversation, there is no doubt that the future is bright. There is no doubt that as young people, we still have a lot of work cut out for us. And I think this theme of reimagining what the National Democratic Revolution should be and what it should achieve, it's very important because it's the first starting point of building a particular vision of a South Africa that we envisage. Because I feel the blueprint of a future South Africa is in our heads, and we need to really play that part without fear or favor, even if it means sometimes we need to be critical of the movement. We need to do that, and we should not do that frivolously, but we should do it with a strategic intent that has particular strategic goals in mind, so that our impact, can be able to be meaningful. So, guys, thank you so much for really joining us. As you can see, I'm wearing a Tintswalo t-shirt. So this is my uniform every time we have these conversations. And if you want one of these t-shirts, you can approach us. There are young people who are selling these t-shirts, which are written I am Tintswalo. If you want one of these, please do approach us. Those who have my direct contact, they can approach me, then I'll direct them to the relevant people. Maybe next week we can share their contacts as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and have yourselves a good night. Please tell your friends to tell their friends that in Zolo's perspective, it's up and running. They must come and join us. Thank you very much, and have yourselves a good night.